Hey guys, welcome back to Willpower Garage. Today we're working on a 2001 Audi TT, and I'm going to show you how to replace the downpipe. Looking from underneath the vehicle, you can see, or lack thereof, this is the end of the downpipe. And even if I try to look up here, this is the all-wheel drive unit, and you still can barely see the downpipe. Don't be too intimidated here. See, it's right about there. Don't be too intimidated because, luckily enough, the engine in these vehicles is supported by two engine mounts, one on the engine itself and another on the transmission, both of which tie into the frame rails. So what that's going to do for us is we can disconnect the torque arm mount, or the dog bone, as some people call it, and we can actually drop the subframe, or at least lower it down to get us better access to get up in here. So we can disconnect the downpipe and be able to get it out. Because as you can see here, there's not a lot of room. I mean, we have a drive shaft in the way up here. As you can tell, my catalytic converters here and the bolts holding it are pretty gnarly. I'm not even going to attempt to take these off until I get the entire downpipe out. Then I'll battle this, try to clean it all up nice so I have a nice new gasket sealing surface. But up to this point, I already have the catback exhaust off, from the resonator to the muffler. I have that off for something else I was doing, but it would have to come off anyway to remove it the way I have it here. But first thing we're going to have to do is we're going to lower the subframe. It is relatively straightforward, and I'm going to show you guys how to do it without having to disconnect brake lines or hoses or have to bleed anything. Even the steering rack we're going to leave into place. Basically what we're going to do first, obviously we're going to take the wheels off. We're going to disconnect the lower ball joint. There's 3 bolts that hold that to the control arm because we're going to leave the control arm on the subframe. We're going to remove the reinforcements from both sides. And then there are 4 13mm bolts, 2 here, 2 here, and that's what holds the steering rack to the subframe. That's going to allow us to leave the steering rack attached to the steering column, but disconnected from the subframe so we can lower the subframe down. We also don't have to take it off of the steering knuckle itself, or the bearing carrier as Audi calls it. A couple other things. Now this thing is missing its belly pan, but you do have to disconnect the splash shields and the belly pan if you do have one still. So we will take those off because they do attach to the subframe. And then finally, I'm going to disconnect the sway bar end links from both sides before we remove the 4 bolts, or 4 main bolts that hold the subframe to the car. Obviously, as I mentioned before, we need to disconnect the dog bone here. The only thing that is holding is the engine torque moving back and forth this way. So when you take this out, don't be surprised if the engine shifts towards the back of the car. Probably won't with this since it is all-wheel drive and the drive shaft is there. But we do have to take this off since it is attached to the motor. So first thing first, I'm going to get the tires off so I can get the lower ball joints apart. And then we'll get the subframe down. I'll show you guys what we're dealing with. As you can see, there's the complete subframe. I don't know if you could tell really from the time lapse, but it really did not take long to get it out. The only thing I did forget was the mount there, the hanger that holds the downpipe. But, if anything, it just held the subframe up for me so I can get it off and down easier. But now you can see I have so much more access, and I'm sure the camera doesn't do it any justification here, but with the side shield gone, the subframe gone, I can see now, at least on mine, I have 3 bolts that hold the downpipe, which is this here. Never mind this weird kludge together, rigged up fix to try to repair the flex. That is the reason why I am replacing this downpipe. But now I can get to the 3 bolts that hold the downpipe to the turbo. Like I said, I'm taking it down with the catalytic converters in place, mostly because, as you can see here, I've got, 20 plus years of rust holding this all together. So I'm most likely going to have to cut these bolts off, and then I will, sand down the flange on the cat if it needs it. Hopefully it'll be nice and flat still. A couple of new gaskets in there, and I should be fine. But, like I said, everything is still up here. The brake caliper, the axles I didn't have to remove, the tie rod end here, the steering rack, everything is in place. The only thing, and the only reason why I would still recommend an alignment is because the lower ball joint mounts are slotted. So, it doesn't go into just a fixed hole, not to mention the subframe has a little bit of play in it. So it's going to push the geometry off a little bit. So it's a good idea after you drop the subframe to get your downpipe off, or if you drop the subframe for any reason, to get a wheel alignment. So from here, I now have to battle those rusty bolts or nuts that are holding the downpipe to the turbo. I might need to bust out the hot wrench just to heat them up a little bit, but I want to really avoid snapping those studs because that makes this even more work. Looking at this thing, I was having some trouble trying to figure out how I was going to get to these bolts. There's not really enough room for a wrench. You can't really get a socket close enough or even get enough swing to try to loosen it. So looking around, I have the hole here where the brake line comes through, and that is a nice straight shot. Well, almost a nice straight shot with a universal and my 17mm socket. And I have a good feeling that I should be able to get to the one up above as well. And then I could probably get to the one below here. I know it's hard to see, but it's about right there. I'm thinking I can get through it from here. So I just wanted to point that out so you guys aren't scratching your head as well, trying to figure out how to get this out this way. As you can see, there it is out. So I've got to just now break, cut, do whatever I got to do to get these old bolts off of the old downpipe and put in my replacement. Now, this is an aftermarket one, so it's not the greatest quality. But again, this is a fairly old car, and this is what the customer wanted. It is a good opportunity, though, if you have to replace it because of flex, to put a nice, decent-sized downpipe on these, because you do get quite a good performance gain from a bigger downpipe. The one thing I do recommend, if you are replacing the downpipe, it's a good idea to put a new O2 sensor in at the same time. 2 reasons for that. One, that O2 sensor that's in there has been in there for quite a while, and it will be stubborn to get out of there. Mine is really hacked up, and the guy wondered why he had some weird check engine lights. I mean, there you have it. Tech tip of the day here. Don't ever use crimp connections on O2 sensors. They're unreliable. The wires will corrode. You'll get funky settings and readings, and the computer won't know what's going on, especially for the main O2 sensor that's doing all your fueling. So I'm going to replace it with a brand new one. And I ordered a brand new mating connector from Audi with pins that I'm going to wire into the factory harness. So this will be restored back to original. But like I said, that old O2 sensor, besides being old and probably a little contaminated and maybe not bad now, but rather than fighting for it, I went and just purchased a brand new O2 sensor. I think this one was maybe $40. It wasn't a lot of money. So I'm just going to use the new one, put into my new pipe, and put my new pipe back into the car. As you can see from the time lapse, I went ahead and I reinstalled the catalytic converter pipe before I put the subframe in. The reason is, you know, this catalytic converter pipe used to have studs that went in here and then just nuts on the other side. Obviously, at some point, somebody had changed these. That's why they were as gnarly looking as they were. Also, you saw that I took the flanges to my belt sander to try to true up the surfaces so I know I have a nice even gasket surface for this to seal up. And then I went and just put new hardware on both sides with flange bolts. These are locking type flange bolts. And because of that, I also had to grind the backside because of the way the rust was. It was an uneven surface, so I just tried to grind this with my angle grinder as best as I could so the nuts sit nice and flat. But I wanted to be able to tighten these from this side because I have access now before the subframe goes up. As for the nuts on the turbo, I also put anti-seize on the 3 studs before I installed the downpipe. So that way it's a little easier to get up there. I'm not making a mess on the pipe or on the nuts or getting it all over the place. Then I put my nuts in, new gasket, and then ran those bolts down tight. I did leave the O2 sensor out. The reason I did that now was so I had movement to get that pipe up into the maze here. You know, it's got a weird bend to it, going around the drive shaft and everything. I was afraid it was just going to be in the way, so I'll put that in from the top. Again, I'll probably put a little extra anti-seize on. Like I said, I'm putting a new sensor in. They usually put a little bit on the threads already, you know, underneath that plastic cap. But I will more likely just put a little extra on. So from here, basically all I'm going to do now is I'm going to take my subframe. I'll probably clean up the mount areas for the steering rack. I might actually put a little, you know, these actually look pretty well greased up. I was going to say now is a good opportunity to either replace or lubricate your sway bar bushings since you have it out. Alright guys, as you can see, installing a new downpipe in this car is not very difficult. Well, it is a little tricky just getting the subframe out, but I'd say more tricky to get it back in, especially working by yourself, which is why I got creative with the pipe, but trying to hold it up. But that's it for today's video. Please again, don't forget to like, subscribe, share the videos, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye guys.